So on this 250 KX250F, I noticed blue gasket maker around this valve cover, and that makes me instantly suspicious. So the customer was saying that this bike was hard to start. I've had 3 of these before, and it's always valve train. Whenever these things start to get hard to start, I suspect valves are too tight or need adjustment. It's almost guaranteed. Don't keep riding the bike. If you get where you have to roll it and stuff, it's never going to get better. If you just stop, you'll save yourself a lot of leg pain too. But if you notice these timing marks on the cam, there's one at the top and there's one located parallel to this gasket. This exhaust cam, instead of being 12 o'clock, is about 1 o'clock. And the dot forward is not parallel with the gasket. So for some reason someone's been in here and they've either the timing chain has gotten loose and that cam's rolled. I started to think about this. How would that affect? So it has retarded the exhaust cam lobe. And what is 1 tooth of gear gonna mean for the engine in degrees? Well, that's about 5 degrees of cam duration. Not necessarily what's keeping this thing so hard from running, but why? Why not just make it right? So I'm gonna fix that. Of course, this bike's not in for that, but that's kind of what I do. I do a total audit. So we'll put that tooth where it should be and check the valves. And the reason that the bike has been stripped so much, you can see I've got the rear subframe off, tank, shroud, fenders, is because I'm going to clean this carburetor. That's a good place to start too when you don't know. This is the first time I've seen this bike. I'm kind of getting an overall feel of it. Let me walk in front of you here. So I remove the rear subframe, take the swing arm or the shock, disconnect that, rotate it back, and I can get to this carburetor a lot easier without breaking this plastic hot start collar by twisting it, or it gives you access, and it also lets you inspect these areas like your swing arm in places that don't get seen too often. While I'm sitting here talking, this is something you cannot hide. If you want to know how well used a used Kawasaki is, these are getting more popular because people have replaced them with fuel injected bikes. For a lot of people, these are now their first motorcycles. The price has gone down, so this could be 3rd, 4th hand by the time you get it. Look at this. Look at this frame. It's aluminum, soft, and how well worn this portion is where a boot hits will tell you how much this bike's been ridden. And also, if you're really lucky, sometimes you can find these that haven't been ridden at all, and you can look at the tire, the rear tire, the front tire, look at the date on them. This one happens to be the 25th week of 2014, so it's a 2007 with at least a 2014 tire on it. That tells you that it's had 7 years potentially of riding, and that someone really worked on it last, or was maintaining it in 2014. So that makes me think, hey, if they're not putting tires on it, and they're definitely not changing oil on this bike, someone's been in here doing timing chain. That's your overall feel. Don't let things bother you like brake levers, clutch levers, handlebars being bent, fenders being bent. All that stuff comes off and replaces really easily, and even experts drop brand new bikes. Your bike could be the most maintained thing ever, and you can break a lever easy. So that stuff stands out, but don't let it distract you from the stuff you can't change, like frame wear and bushing wear, and where the chain's been digging in here. You can tell if someone's run a chain too long. Look at your sprockets, that stuff. Oil leaks around this will tell you if they've had the chain too tight, or you can tell if people jump them and stuff to move on to the suspension with clues like that. Whether this chain's been chewing into the swing arm, especially on the Yamaha WRs, they do that. And yeah, so let's get this carburetor cleaned. I'm gonna ultrasonic clean it, check the valves, clearance, and move this cam 1 tooth. Well, I'm gonna do that first, but stay tuned. So I've taken the rear subframe off, unbolted here, undone the air filter tube from the carburetor, and undone the bolt for the rear shock to swing it back just a bit. And then pull the whole subframe off. And that allows me access to everything. This bike had a extended oil tube off that breather, which is a good idea. I've seen them with the original short one, and they drip oil all the time. If the oil's over serviced, it'll do it for sure until the oil level kind of drops off. But if you put a longer tube on there, this goes over the intake manifold, and all that oil and vapor would have to make kind of like a P-trap in a sink where it can't make this turn, it'll run back down into the tank. So that's a good idea. Loosen this screw here. This is the aft or the back carburetor bolt screw piece. Yeah, terminology correct. And I'm going to get needle nose and carefully unscrew the hot start housing with the cable in it. These break, so take your time. And after I get this loose, I'm going to twist the carburetor this direction, back it off, undo the drain hoses from its keeper, and then get to the throttle cable, remove that, and then pull the carburetor out that direction. Went ahead and did the lower shock mount bolt, removed it, lifts the shock right out of the way. Shocking. Unclamped these hoses, slid them aside, and now I have ease of access to the throttle cables. Allen bolt on the top. Pull the cover off and put that aside. Remove the throttle cable, and then we'll dump this thing into the ultrasonic parts cleaner. Before you go crazy and rip every screw that you can find out of a carburetor, count the turns on your idle mixture screw so you can put it back that way. It's a good starting point. You know it ran that way. So turn it to tight. Well, look at there. It's all the way tight. So there's nothing. I know that's incorrect. That's probably another issue with starting and idling. So we're going to go ahead and back this all the way out. I suspected that when I saw this knob on here. It makes it too easy for people to tinker. As far as a carburetor cleaner, I use Simple Green and heat it. And if you don't heat it too much, it does better for aluminum. So I stay around 20 degrees Celsius. But I've tried Purple Power, and it makes a mess of aluminum. It makes it like white, chalky, corroded looking stuff. So I wouldn't recommend that. And as far as disassembling this, I'm going to take the bottom float bowl off, the choke knob out, set those aside, and leave all the jets, fuel pump, leave everything assembled that I can. Hold it by these hoses and drop it right in and just give it a quick soak. I don't suspect anything's wrong with this carburetor other than that adjustment, but I'm going to look at my jet numbers and things like that to kind of know where I'm at. Cleaning is kind of a bonus here. That's a new one, floating O-ring. I have to figure that out here in a second. Got the carb out, it's pretty clean. I'm going to use compressed air to blow out all the passageways, the body, and then I'll follow up those passageways with some carb cleaner. Watch out, pup. She's used to this. I've got the throttle held open. Clean that main jet. Spray some through the fuel inlet. Little hole over there. Don't forget your air screws on the back side of your intake. It's connected. Intake, there's a little hole there. See it squirting off. Spray some through the hot start or the choke, I can't remember. Through that one. That's pretty much it. I've pulled the throttle back all the way to look at the needle to make sure it's clean too, just in case the ultrasonic didn't get it. And it was good. It looks good. So now I'm gonna pull these jets out individually and then look at the numbers on them and write that down for future reference. So clean your screwdriver off before you take your jets out, especially if you just clean your car. Checking these numbers, the idle, well, it's not idle, it's a funny shaped jet back here. It's not an emulsion jet either. Let's just call it jet. Number 68, the idle jet is a number 42, which is not stock. Someone's changed that, and a 182 main. So I'm gonna take the idle mixture screw and go all the way in, and there is a spring, a rubber O-ring, and a washer on the end of this needle. Make sure that's in place. So I've gone till it's seated lightly. I'm gonna back off 2 turns. Let's go 2 1/4 and leave it at that until the bike's running again. So I'm gonna look at this notch here. 1, 2 1/4. If you back this out to about 3 turns, your jetting's wrong. But the main danger is this screw will back out on its own and fall out, which has happened to me before, even at 2 1/2 turns. So keep that in mind. Make sure that spring is nice and tight. That O-ring I found in the bowl, I thought maybe it came from the drain screw, but it has a big fat O-ring there. So I'm not sure where that little O-ring came from. But that's what happens when you get a used bike. You know, it's hidden surprises everywhere. Say that O-ring theoretically is bouncing around in here. There's a chance that it could get in front of the main jet. You're going bombing down the road, even briefly for a second, and it would be like turning the fuel off for a second. So anything loose in a float bowl's no bueno. Something else to check while I got the float out is the finger on your needle. Make sure it plunges and springs back, and just feel it so you know what I'm talking about. If it's stiff, replace this or work a little more getting that clean. And look all the way around this. Make sure it doesn't have a ring groove or a depression groove or deformation or lifting off. And look into your seat, make sure it looks clean too. But that's going to be it for this carb. Let's throw it back together and move on to the stuff that I'm supposed to be working on. So the valve clearance on the intake is 0.0039, okay, 4 thousandths. And remember, they said that this was hard to start. So I've got the indicator lined up on stator side, gonna go to the intake valve with a 3 thousandths clear. And what do you know? Nothing. Won't go through. But this outboard one is plenty clearance. And actually, I stuck a 6 thousandths in this one, and it cleared too. So let's do some shim adjustment. Good news is we gotta change that anyway. This chain 1 tooth. So we'll loosen the tensioner, cam chain tensioner. Put some slack in here. Knock this exhaust. Roll it 1 notch forward. Put it back on with the chain. Set the chain back on. And then we'll loosen our caps and do our valve adjustment. Let me show you how to do the adjustment math. So the measurements I took with a feeler gauge, I wrote down on cardboard, and I plan on putting the existing bucket and shim in each section, and then I'll measure those. So what I had to do is remove the cam chain tensioner. It's a 12mm bolt with a spring and a rod. Set that aside, then 2 8mm, pull the whole tensioner out. And to retract it, you pull the latch back and close it. Put that aside. 8mm bolts up top, crisscross, and I get a bungee cord and hook it right to the chain and hold it up some way so that it doesn't fall down into the engine. I'm gonna start on the intake side. Grab 2 opposing bolts and wiggle and lift straight up, and watch for this bearing keeper. It goes in the groove on the cap and on the bearing. So make sure you don't let that fall down to the engine. Set that aside. If you get them mixed up, they're marked intake and exhaust. Then I simply grab the cam and lift it out of its pocket. More slack. The bungee cord's working really well. So we've got a magnet on the end of this and pick up the bucket. And in here is the shim. Might be kind of stuck with oil. That's what we're going to measure next. Alright, so I've measured each shim with my caliper. And I've written both measurements in inches and metric here. These shims, they're sold in metric. But in North America, we use inches for clearances, and I'm more familiar personally with inches. All my machine stuff, I end up converting metric to standard. But I just did a quick internet search. Here's the formula if you don't have a computer, but you obviously do. You're watching right now. B minus C plus D equals A, where B value is the existing clearance, this number. And you subtract C, the desired clearance, 7 thousandths on the exhaust, and 6 thousandths on the intake. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the reason I picked 7 thousandths is the factory clearance is 5 to 9. You want to shoot for the middle, and the intake is 39 thousandths, let's say 4 to 75 thousandths, which the middle of that to me is 6 thousandths. So back to the formula. C is the desired clearance, 6 thousandths, and you add D, the existing shim diameter or distance, and that is 0.101 on this intake valve, or 258 millimeters, 0.258 millimeters. The shims are all numbered in metric. So A is the shim value, or you could use one of these computer programs, and that's what I'm going to use this time. I normally do it by hand. TechATV.com, MAULTECHATV.com, Tech Guides Valve Clearance. So the left exhaust valve, you just plug in your data. Recommended valve clearance 7 thousandths, measured valve clearance 7 thousandths. So the original shim was 305. We're going to put a 305 back in there. Complete that for all the steps, and then we'll go on, moving right along. So we've got the shim buckets back in each appropriate valve location. Cam's sitting back on, unhooked my cam chain. Now this is the part where I think people get scared or they mess up, or I don't know. Here's what I do, and I don't have trouble. Is you've got your 12 o'clock dot on each cam, and then you've got a dot 45 degrees from it that's parallel to the gasket. Put your finger on the cam chain and put the slack out that direction, and then make sure the dots are still right. Taking the slack out that's how people get off a tooth in the very beginning. And before you say it's good, check your mark again. Turn the engine over with Kickstarter, and that's the direction of the engine. The first mark you pass will be your ignition mark, and the second will be top dead center. And if you want to further make sure, just remove the spark plug and use a wooden dowel or something and see how high it travels, or a dial indicator if you've got the right tools. I think this is the part most people mess up or get scared. And after all this is bolted up, I'm going to rotate the engine by hand first to make sure that no valves are in the way. Cam's reinstalled. This is my favorite part, putting this cam chain tensioner in. There's a rod, spring over that, a cap bolt. Don't forget your washer, and this will start to click as you push it. So the valve trim adjustment has been completed, and I had to go back and revisit that left intake valve. I assumed the clearance, because there was none, I assumed it was, or did the math for 0, and even after the one adjustment of 6 thousandths, I had to make another one. So there was a total of 10 thousandths lack of clearance. That's something to kind of get your hair standing up a little bit. That means that valve's either stretching. Ooh, and the result of that would be that valve eventually snapping and going in. So that's something to monitor. We're putting the carburetor back on, and I give the throttle a twist and see which cable pulls. And on this bike, that cable goes underneath the cam. There's D-shaped washers. The round part goes outboard. The flat part goes inboard. That keeps the cable from falling through the gap. So you tighten these up with a 10mm sock or 10mm box wrench. Nothing crazy. Crank it down. We're going to put the cover on and then mount the carburetor to the spigot. Came around to this side and push the carburetor forward, and there is a tooth that engages a groove on this rubber boot that gets this carburetor at the right angle for the floats to work correctly. Tighten that band clamp. Reinstall the hot start cable. Take your time, don't strip it, don't break it. It happens a lot, especially on Polaris for some reason. So the last thing I've got to do is route this oil tube back over the intake. It's keeping this chafe stuff at the top where it touches the carburetor. Run that down by the swing arm. Move this snake skin back down.